Welcome. I'm Jim Ferris, the director of the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy at the USC Saul Price School of Public Policy. We have observed a heightened awareness and a greater urgency to address the inequities laid bare in recent years. This has highlighted the work of leaders on the front lines for social change. Leading Boldly, the USC Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy's new series focuses on emerging leaders who are working on an array of issues and varying approaches to create a more equitable society. We highlight 4 remarkable individuals whose life experience give them inspiration and strength. They share their personal stories, reflect on their leadership journeys, and offer lessons to kindred spirits and those who support them. Fred Ali, the former president and the CEO of the Weingart Foundation in Los Angeles, who has himself spent years advancing equity through his work in the nonprofit sector, engages these bold leaders in conversation. Fred then concludes with some reflections and observations for philanthropy. We here at the Center believe that the next frontier for social impact is bold leadership. And it is important to recognize that such leadership comes from all quarters, especially from unsuspecting places. Philanthropy can play an important role by encouraging bold action for change and investing in emerging leaders. Let me introduce my colleague, Fred Ali.
Hello, Desmond, it's so great to be with you today. Desmond Meade, the president of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, is my guest today. And Desmond, we want to talk a little bit today about your leadership journey, the incredible work of the coalition. I want to specifically talk about the Amendment 4 campaign, and then ask you for some advice on how we might encourage the kind of bold leadership that you've been demonstrating over the years. But before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about your background. You were born in St. Croix and grew up in Florida. And as you have openly discussed, you struggled with drug addiction, homelessness, you were incarcerated. And while in jail, you discovered an interest in the law, started doing some law study in the library, and fast forwarding, you eventually got your law degrees from Florida International University. You became president of the Florida Rights Restoration Commission around 2009, and ultimately led the movement, the Amendment 4 movement and campaign that led to restoration of voting rights for approximately 1.4 million people. So an incredible story. Among many honors that you've received, you've been recognized by Time magazine as one of the most influential people in the world. You are a MacArthur Fellow. I think that you received that in 2020, sometimes referred to as the MacArthur Genius Award. You are also a global fellow with the Ford Foundation. So a lot of things going on.
That's a lot.
Yeah. And I also want to say that this is an incredible book, Let My People Vote, which you published in 2020. I think everyone who's interested in putting together a well-conceived and effective movement ought to read this book. It's a fabulous story. So I want to start by talking about your leadership journey. And as I mentioned in my introduction, you've talked very openly and very courageously about some of the challenges you faced in your early life. In your 2020 book, Let My People Vote, you wrote, well, maybe if I can take all the pain and suffering and low self-esteem, all that stuff that came together and led me to these railroad tracks, maybe I could package it in a positive way to help other people so that they don't have to end up on these railroad tracks. That could be a start. So Desmond, could you take us back to that moment and what motivation you found at that time and the commitments that you made that eventually led you to your work with the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition?
Well, Fred, thank you so much for that. When I think back to that moment when I was standing in front of railroad tracks, waiting on that train to come so I could jump in front of it, there's like so much emotion that come over me now, but I remember that particular day, there was a lot of despair, right? I mean, I had no self-esteem. There was no proverbial light at the end of the tunnel, and I was like really at my lowest. Sometimes I skip over a certain part of the story about what happened the night before, right? And I think it's so relevant to our discussion was that the night before I actually went to a church to ask a particular pastor to pray for me. I was so desperate. I spent the last money I had to take a one-way trip to this church with the hope that, if this person prayed for me, that my life would improve. And I remember getting to the church and at the end of the service asking the pastor to pray for me, and the pastor told me I had to make an appointment for the following day. And I was just like blown away. And I remember walking out of that church thinking, man, even God has turned his back on me. And that night was the first time in my entire life that I slept outside in public, like in a very visible location. In the past, while I was homeless, I've always slept like maybe in abandoned homes or maybe even behind a Dipsy dumpster, right? But never just out in public. But that night, I slept on a bus bench, right, right next to a major a road in Dade County. I had given up. It was it. I was done. And so that following day, when I was standing in front of those railroad tracks, there was nowhere left for me to go. That was it. And it was a very, very painful experience, right? But, when I did, eventually, of course, the train didn't come and I eventually crossed those tracks. But when I crossed it, I stopped and I asked myself, how many people would have came to my funeral if that train would have killed me? And the answer was zero, and that was so empty, right? It made me feel like, man, what have I done with my time on this earth? Since I was born, have my life been that insignificant that even after all these years, even living these different places, the Virgin Islands, South Florida, Illinois, being in the military in Hawaii and all other places, having friendships and relationships, only like, well, first of all, nobody would have came, but in the best case scenario with my, I imagine maybe if my name was on the headlines or the front page of the Miami Herald with my picture, Desmond killed by train, how many people would come to my funeral? And thinking about only 4 people would come, and maybe out of the 4, maybe 2 would have shed a tear. It really made me question the time that I spent. And so I think that served as a launching pad, to really make me commit. And I hear the word leader, and sometimes I cringe. I'm like, I don't know if I'm a leader. One thing I do know, the despair created in me was a strong desire to be a servant, right? To serve others. And so that's where it came, that maybe I could take these things that led me to the railroad tracks and contemplating suicide, take those things and use it in such a way to help other people. And that's been my journey ever since. It's just a strong dedication, not to lead people, but to just help other people, right? And I think that when you talk about leadership, I think it's born out of a desire to serve, right? Not to out of a desire to lead, but a desire to serve.
Desmond, you talked about discovering God's plan for you. And what I hear you saying is that plan was to be in service to others.
It was just that simple.
Yeah.
When I remember being in the treatment center, so the moment that I made that discovery was, actually right before I graduated from drug treatment, and I had already decided that I wanted to make a difference in this earth, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to do it. I wasn't organized. I didn't know anything about issues and all of that stuff, But what I did know is that I needed to help people, and it just so happened that we had a therapy session, and right after, a young man came and he approached me and told me that something that I said caused him to experience a paradigm shift, caused him to have a different outlook of life, caused him to have hope.
Right.
And when he told me that, something erupted inside of me that I'd never felt before. Today I know that I was experiencing a joy that I was chasing all my life, right? And it was a joy that I didn't even know existed, right? And that was that purpose. And I remember standing in the yard when this feeling was overwhelming me, and I started looking around, and I noticed that everything in nature took a little and gave a little, right? And I'm a part of nature. And so it seemed like a natural fit that I'm supposed to give back, right? I mean, you look at all of the living things on the earth. I mean, from the bees to the elephants, you've seen that this was this natural cycle. We took something from the land and we gave something back to the land. And so I thought about how we as human beings, we get so consumed with acquiring things. Gimme, 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 gimme. What can I get? What can I get? And we overwhelm ourselves with that and not necessarily with what can we give, right? And so I realized that for me, the secret sauce was to live a life trying to figure out how to give back, not necessarily how to give.
So, Desmond, I'm going to refer to you as a leader again, if you don't mind, because you are a great leader. But reading the things you've written in the past, listening to other interviews you've done, getting to know you over these last couple months, you really talk with humility, conviction. You allow yourself to be vulnerable. Do you see yourself as that kind of a leader, and do you think it's important for leaders to share their vulnerability with the people they work with, the communities they serve?
Most definitely. One of the things I learned, a matter of fact, even in the work that I do now, around criminal justice reform, around expanding democracy, I always refer back to a movie called 8 Mile. And it was a story of Eminem. And the part I loved was how, he was battling this other rapper, and typically rappers, they diss each other or talk about each other. And the first time he went to battle this guy, he got stuck, right? And people made fun of him, right? But he had a second chance. And when he battled this person, the champion, right before he went on, he had a friend called Rabbit. And the guy, was said, hey, what you gonna do when he talks about your mother and talks about stealing your girlfriend? And everybody got mad at this guy for bringing it up to Eminem. But, you seen where Eminem paused. And when he did go out on stage to battle, he brought all that stuff up himself, right? And realized that, man, listen, you've got to beat other people in telling your story. You've got to be the one that controls your narrative, which means that you have to be transparent. You have to be willing to be vulnerable, because the things that you try to hide is going to eventually be exposed. And the question you ask yourself is, do you want to be the one to expose your weakness, or you want someone else to expose it, or your fallacies or whatever? And so I always believed in, you beat people at sharing your story, which, allows me to be even more comfortable, right, in sharing that. But then here's the other tie back, which is, I believe, was the original. When I, talked about, right, really, how do I take all of the pain and suffering that led me to the railroad tracks and use it in such a way to help other people so they don't have to go to the railroad tracks? That entails me talking about those things, right, that would make me vulnerable. And if I don't become vulnerable, then I rob someone, right, of being able to benefit from my experience and my pain and my suffering. And now my pain and suffering is still going to be negative, right? It becomes something positive when other people can glean from it, when other people's lives are impacted. And so vulnerability is a necessity in my work, because in being vulnerable, it allows other people to see all of me, and to be able to tap into those areas that they can connect with and know that there is a pathway forward. So, for instance, I remember when I did get the Time 100 most influential in the world, and we were at the gala, right, with all of the celebrities and everything were there. And I remember I was sitting at the table with one of the executives of Time magazine, and I told him, I was like, "You guys really messed up. You dropped the ball on this one, right?" And they were like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Yeah, you messed up real bad, because for the edition of the Time 100 that year, they had a picture of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson on the cover. I was like, you should have had me on the cover, right? And it wasn't that I was being conceited or anything. What I told him was this: having me on the cover says to this country, says to the world, that you don't have to be a movie star. You don't have to be an athlete. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be a politician to have an impact in your community, in your state, or even the world, right? And if you had my picture on there, folks can see, man, if a guy that was homeless, addicted to drugs, in and out of prison or jails, right, could turn his life around and be one of the 100 most influential person in the world, then that means that anyone reading that magazine or looking at that cover can believe that they too can have an impact, right? And putting in Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson on the cover is limiting so many people's hope. And so that's what I told him. I was like, should have had me on there. So the vulnerability is key because it can inspire so many people.
Right. And I was going to ask you later, Desmond, if you're a hopeful person, but I think I've just received the answer to that question. So hope is a part of is a strong part of your motivation as well. So let's talk about the Amendment 4 campaign, which passed overwhelmingly in 2018, restored voting rights to 1.4 million returning citizens. It's been described by many people as one of the most incredible grassroots campaign in history. Some people have described it as not only an inspiring but a somewhat surprising political victory as well. Can you tell us what has happened since the 2018 vote, since Amendment 4 passed? I know there was some initial setbacks from the state government here in Florida. So can you bring us up to date on what's happening?
You know, I'm often asked that question, and I always tend to push people back in the timeline a little bit because I don't think, it gets enough attention. I think what's, so beautiful and remains to be beautiful about the Amendment 4 campaign. A lot of people look at the numbers. They look 1.4 million, the largest expansion of voting rights in how many years, and and that is huge, right? And there's that's Amendment 4 has created the impact that we're going to feel for so many years to come. But I think what's lost in that conversation is how we did it, right? That, like I tell folks, that we had over 5.1 million people that voted yes on Amendment 4. A million more people voted for our Constitutional Amendment than for the governor of the state of Florida, right? And over a million people who voted for Amendment 4 were also Republicans, right? I tell people this. Probably the greatest thing about Amendment 4, and it's no disservice to voting advocates or anything like that, but I believe the greatest thing was that when I looked at those 5.1 million votes, I didn't see votes that was based on hate or votes that was based on fear. Rather, I saw votes that was based on love, forgiveness, and redemption. And we showed the world that night, we showed the state of Florida, this country, that love can in fact win the day. That we don't have to tear each other apart, right? We don't have to be fearful of each other, right? Or create this hysteria in order to accomplish, right, significant victories or advances, human rights advances. That we can do it in a way that actually brings people together, people from all walks of life and all political persuasions, all different demographics or ideologies, that we could actually bring people together to accomplish great things in this country. And I think that, yes, the greatness of Amendment 4 and what it's been able to accomplish is great, but I think what's even greater was the process, right? And the process is very important in any conversations moving forward when we talk about even what happened, right? Because it's so easy to say, yes, Florida legislature that was dominated by Republicans came out with this legislation that created a mandate that folks had to pay outstanding legal financial obligations before they were able to register to vote. And man, yes, we can get hyper focused on that and lose sight of that bigger picture, right? And see what we're really fighting against, right? And I think that was so much deeper. And so what I tell folks, even back then, when the legislature did require the payment of fines and fees, one of the first things that I would say to any interviewer, any news station was, listen, where other people see obstacles, we see opportunities, right? Taking that negative energy and finding ways to turn it into something positive, right? And so whatever the legislature did, we figured gave us an opportunity to get even deeper engaged in organizing, right? And to continue to elevate our message of love, right? Forgiveness and redemption, right? In very unique ways that stood as a stark contrast to the politicization of something that is basic, right? Something that should be universal, right? And something that should not be a partisan debate or even a racial debate, right? It should be a discussion about human rights and dignity. And so we was able to maintain a high road and fight tooth and nail to continue to elevate the work that we're doing above partisan politics and implicit racial biases.
So, Desmond, I want to go back to 2011. You were relatively new in your work at the coalition, and Governor Scott, I think, had begun to roll back a lot of the gains that had been won for returning citizens. The other thing that I recall was going on is a lot of the organizations that had previously supported the coalition had started to fall away. In your book, you describe this as really a low point for the coalition. But despite all that, you decided to push forward. I mean, in many respects, this really gets to the whole point of bold leadership. You decided to exercise some bold leadership and push forward in what ultimately became the ballot initiative. So what did you see at that time that maybe a lot of other people, most people didn't see?
That's a great question. I guess what I saw was my pain and suffering at the end of the day, And I think that, especially when you talk about bold leadership, I think sometimes some of the elements that can help create that boldness is the proximity to the pain, right? If you're the one that has a headache, right, and your significant other don't have the headache, there's a stronger commitment to ending that headache. You would have that. And so in this case, in this scenario, you're talking about restoring voting rights to people with previous felony convictions. I was one of those individuals. All of the other organizations and the leadership in the other organizations, they were not like me. They had their rights. And so it was much easier for them to walk away and to focus on other issues. I didn't have the luxury of that choice, right? I like to tell folks sometimes of the analogies between commitment and contribution, and I always refer to the ham and cheese omelet, right? Knowing that, the ham and cheese, the elements are the egg, the ham, the cheese, sometimes the milk, right? And those ingredients come from the chicken, the cow, and the pig, right? And so I tell folks that the chicken, right, by giving the egg, made a contribution to the ham and cheese omelet. The cow, by giving the milk and eventually the cheese, made a contribution to the ham and cheese omelet. But the pig made a commitment to the ham and cheese omelet, right? And there's a distinction there. And that distinction showed itself, right? Because at the end of the day, I couldn't just make a contribution and walk away, right? I could not vote the next day. And so I had to give my life, right? I was a pig in that. Now, here's the thing, right? A lot of times folks, right, oh, well, let's get mad at the people that walked away or whatever. No, you don't get mad at that because guess what? You need all those ingredients to make a good ham and cheese omelet, right? So everything is needed, but it's just about knowing the role, right? And so in Amendment 4, none of those organizations could have led Amendment 4 because none of those organizations was in the position of the pig. None of those organizations was in the position where they said, we're going to give our organizational life, we're going to die on this hill, right, as far as with restoration of voting rights. Desmond was. Desmond still is today. I remember 2 summers ago really crying in my backyard because it dawned on me that I finally found something other than my family that I was willing to die for, right? I'm willing to put my life on the line so that every American citizen have an opportunity to have their voice heard and to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their sexual identity, matter of fact, even the immigration status, regardless of their political preferences, the color of their skin, it didn't matter to me. If you live in this country, you should have a say in how you're being governed, right? And that is the thing that I've discovered that I'm willing to die for. And so when 2011 happened and Governor Scott created these policies that made it even more difficult for people to have their rights restored, yeah, it was just through natural osmosis that I would emerge from that and take on that leadership role because I was the pig in that situation. I was the one that had to give his life and was willing to do so.
Desmond, if I can remind you what you said in your book about this, you said, I had never done anything like this or even close to this in all my life, but I knew I could figure it out. You also said, I'm not going to wait for anybody else to take up the fight. If it means so much to me, I have to be the initiator. So,
Yes. Oh my God. One of the story that I tell, and sometimes my wife get mad at me for telling it, but I remember I was in elementary school and I had a crush on this one girl in my class. And I was too shy to even, to ask her, if she liked me. And back in those days, you write a note, do you like me? Check yes or no on the box. And what I did was I sent my best friend to find out if she liked me. And my best friend never came back. He took the girl. And I tell folks that I learned at an early age to never depend on anyone to get the things that you desire or need, right? That you have to take ownership of it. And I tell folks today that that's the reason why I have the most amazing wife today, because when I realized that she was the one for me, I did not rely on anyone. This time, I was not going to send anyone to ask her if she liked me or not. I took on that responsibility of making sure that I took ownership of getting the things that I need.
I said earlier that I think that the Amendment 4 process that you describe in Let My People Vote is a textbook case on how to run an effective movement and campaign. Scholars have talked about elements of effective campaigns like strategy and collaboration, narrative. Amendment 4 campaign had all of that and more. So how did you figure it all out? And what if, can you talk a little bit more about maybe specific elements of that campaign that you think made it as effective as it did?
Wow, sometimes I laugh at that thought because the image that pops in my head are the penguins in Madagascar
Right.
that's building the plane, right, as they're trying to fly it. And on the surface, it don't look like they know what they're doing, but at the end of the day, they get to where they got to go. Whether taking over a big ship or a plane or whatever. The space I'm in now, I've never been before. But you just have to have faith and really believe. I think what I was really able to latch on to early on with the campaign is that the belief that deep down inside of each and every one of us, there's some core values, right, that we all share, regardless, right? Even in terms of Amendment 4, when I thought about, restoring voting rights to people with felony convictions, right? People who made mistakes, right? And I'm thinking, you know what? For the most part, deep down inside, everybody wants to be forgiven, right? And I remember I used to ask, how many of us don't ever want to be forgiven for anything that we've ever done in our lives for the rest of our lives, right? And what you would find is that almost everyone would say no at some point. Yes, I want to be forgiven. And so there were some core values that I believe that was shared. What I determined early on was a lot of times we take ourselves out of certain equations and exclude people from equations by putting labels on stuff, right? And how we characterizing ourselves. And it limits who we can talk to and who can talk to us. I knew from the very beginning, because I traveled around the state, had various conversations. I'm gonna tell you, when I first was aware of felon disenfranchisement, I thought only African Americans were impacted by it. But traveling around the state, man, my eyes were open and I seen, wait a minute, it's more than just African Americans that was impacted by felon disenfranchisement, right? And so I knew early on that, man, wait a minute, I need to get as many people as possible, right, involved in this, right? And I didn't know it at the time because I don't ever consider myself to be this political genius or whatever. I didn't know at the time about the tribalism that existed in our society, right? You know, it's their side and our side, you know? And how, you know, most folks be like, man, I want to pass this. So what I need to do is get all the people on my side to say yes for it. And we just keep those other people out of it, whatever. And hopefully we can fight tooth and nail and get it. My approach was, man, listen, I need people from all walks of life and all political persuasions because those are the people who are impacted, right? I needed people to fight for their family, right? And so when you talk about even some of the core values, man, unknowingly, one of the core values was love.
Right.
Because when Governor Scott revised the policies and made it more difficult for people to vote, the very first thing I did was like, I thought about it. I was like, this guy just won by 60,000 votes, right? And what I do know is that over, if I'm not mistaken, over 1.7 million people of color who was registered didn't even vote in that election. And I thought about, wait a minute, there's 1.54 million returning citizens. What if half of those individuals get 5 family members who are registered voters to pledge to vote on their behalf? And that's what I did. I got these pledge cards together and I was giving them to returning citizens and say, hey, get 5 family members or friends who are registered voters to pledge to vote for you, vote for love, thinking that blood is thicker than water, right? And trying to create a moral dilemma for individuals. So when they're going in that voting booth, they're going to either vote according to what the slick sounding politician is telling them, or they're going to vote so they can improve the lives of someone who they go to bed with every night or they sit across at the dinner table from. And so love was a grounding principle in the campaign from the very beginning. And I'll be the first to tell you, I didn't come up with this idea and say, hey, let's do it by love. It was just a natural progression. You know, how are we connecting people with people who they love and moving them along those lines instead of political lines or even racial lines? And that kept developing, right? And it allowed us to go to any part of the state we wanted to and ask that universal question. Do you know anyone you love who's ever made a mistake? Right? That's who I want you to fight for. I don't want you to fight for me because you might be racist. You might not like me for the color of my skin. You might be a Republican and don't want Democrats to take over the state. But what I do know is that if you love your daughter, your granddaughter, your uncle, right, that you would go ahead and vote for them.
You know, Desmond, what I'm hearing also is that you took the time to get out throughout Florida, listen to a cross-section of people, and you also spent a lot of time very carefully crafting the message and eventually the language of the amendment.
Listen, I had no choice, right? Nobody was flocking to me. I was a nobody. So I had to go out and I had to have those conversations and try to convince organizations and individuals, that felon disenfranchisement was much more than just voting and that there was a vested interest in everyone supporting this because it was tied to criminal justice. It was tied to the economy. It was tied to how we treated people and supporting getting rid of felon disenfranchisement would have benefited the entire state of Florida, even the country. And so, I had to go out there and get folks to come on in, man.
Yeah.
So as related to crafting this message, I mean, one of the things I'm proud of, too, was that really being able to bring so many people together. We had organizations, Brennan Center for Justice, Advancement Project, NAACP, even at the time it was PICO. So many different groups and individuals came together. And we spent like twice as long crafting a one-page amendment than people took crafting 12-page amendments, right? We brought in some of the top constitutional law experts in the state of Florida and across the country, and we analyzed the language, I mean, for quite some time. And so we were very painstaking in crafting that language. And I'm really appreciative of the process, right? And the various considerations that went into eventually landing on the language that we used to successfully pass Amendment 4. But it was a process.
Yeah.
It was a process.
Desmond, you also said that campaigns like this cost a lot of money, and you said that it wasn't always easy to raise this money. That at times you found people sort of reluctant to take the risk and support this campaign. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, once again, you're rekindling all these memories. But yeah, it was, oh my God, especially, when folks walked away, and I'm looking around and I'm by myself. And the only thing I had was that, man, there were some amazing volunteers throughout the entire state, but we didn't have anything. We did not have anything. I mean, it was so bad that, one of our volunteers took the sheets off of her bed and went to an arts and crafts store and bought paint to paint our logo on her sheet so that she could use it as a tablecloth at table events and collect petitions. And it was, I struggled with that for quite some time because in my head, I'm like, man, can't people see how important this issue is? Can't even folks that may not care too much about people like me or whatever, can't they see the impact that this could even have, on the state of Florida, at least the electoral impact that this amendment or this movement have the capacity of shifting the political landscape. I mean, all kinds of reasons. I'm thinking people should have all these different reasons to actually support the campaign financially, but none of it happened. And at the end of the day, once again, we being the pig, we got to keep it moving. And so there was some painful moments. I mean, I remember using, student loans to drive around the state of Florida. I remember there were times that my wife loved to tell a story about when she had to lend me gas money when we were dating because I drove somewhere to speak to a group of maybe about 4 people. Drove across the state to speak to 4 people. We didn't have Zoom back then. At least I didn't know about Zoom. It was a lot of challenges, but today, I'm appreciative of it because it helped, build character in the campaign. It helped build character in myself. And I was able to learn so much because I was forced to have to learn it because no one else was doing it. And so whether it's I am printing petitions, I'm distributing petitions, I am collecting petitions and sorting them out and then turning them in to supervisors of elections. And that allowed me, because typically, I give a good example, typically in a constitutional amendment campaign, you have a professional team come in, collect petitions, and they're shipping boxes to supervisor of elections office. And the supervisor of elections office don't even know who it is or who's running it. In this case, I personally delivered petitions to almost every supervisor of elections in the state of Florida. So I was able to actually meet people in person, right? Establish relationships. And that is way more deeper, right, than some big time operation. And so because there was no money, it allowed me to be ingrained even more into the fabric of our grassroots, whether it's through the volunteers or whether it was through the practitioners or the government officials that we had to deal with. It was more personal in nature, and I was able to get a lot more accomplished.
So, Desmond, just jumping ahead now, the campaign was successful, Amendment 4 passed. Sometimes we hear a critique of movements like this that once you get into the implementation stage, it becomes more difficult to sustain the energy, maintain the support that you had during the campaign. What's been your experience with that now that you're deep into the implementation piece?
Yeah. It's definitely been a challenge, you know. The good thing is that, you know, Florida is so crazy that, you know, they create opportunities to get people excited about continuing to support the work. But those points in between, you know, yes, it is a challenge, you know, because a lot of times, you know, you see people, they're supporting the pretty thing or the popular thing at
Right.
that moment. But then, you know, they move on to something else. You know, it's so easy for us to just get caught up on the surface and not recognize that the true investment is in the depth, right? You find that the reason for it in the depths of what's happening and not necessarily on its surface. And so, yes, it was fancy to support. Yes, let's support a ballot initiative that is going to re-enfranchise 1.4 million voters in the state of Florida, which is a huge thing, but not be as excited about, man, how are we going to get, because, I mean, folks was like unrealistically expecting that 1.4 million people all of a sudden going to become voters the next day. And then, you know, by 2020 election, every last one of those individuals is going to vote. And the reality of the situation is it's not that simple. It's not. You know, I call it the Juneteenth phenomenon, right? Where Juneteenth, you know, we celebrate how the slaves in Galveston did not find out about the Emancipation Proclamation until 2 years after, right? And I remember in 2020 that there was a significant number of returning citizens that didn't even know anything about Amendment 4 or even what it did, you know? Even though the legislature had created, you know, the requirement of paying these fines and fees, that is still over 600,000 returning citizens that were eligible to register to vote right then and there, right? And the challenge, one of the major challenges was we weren't being able to educate enough people as to Amendment 4. You know, we weren't able to reach enough people. And that takes resources, right? And so, you know, we did the best with what we have, but we know that there's much more we could have done.
Yeah. So, in walking around your offices yesterday, I note that there's a lot of people still here reaching out to returning citizens every day, and so the work goes on. It continues. So, I want to segue a little bit and talk about the role of philanthropy. You've talked about a little bit the difficulty during the campaign in raising dollars, and in some respects, that difficulty continues. So, a lot of people from philanthropic leaders and practitioners are going to be listening to this interview. And to the extent that you feel comfortable talking about it, do you have anything you want to say to them? Any advice?
Am I talking directly to them
You
right
are
now?
talking directly to them.
Okay.
This is your opportunity
Wow.
because you've been through
Yeah.
it, and obviously they have a role. And how would you suggest that they might improve the work they do with movements like the one you have led?
Well, I'll start by telling you directly. Listen, number one, there are so many more Desmonds that are out there. If you are like somewhat, even halfway impressed with what I've been able to accomplish, just know that there are a lot more individuals out there that are at the ready to accomplish what I have and even more, right? I think what has made me who I am today, right, as it relates to support, was that I had the freedom to be courageous enough to think outside the box or color outside the lines. You know, a lot of folks, they marvel at what I was able to accomplish with Amendment 4. And, you know, some people might even consider it a masterpiece. But what I tell folks is that when you look at most artists today, whatever genre, whether it's music or in sculpture or in paintings or whatever, that most masterpieces, I think all masterpieces, were created by people that was courageous enough to color outside the lines. And so what I would tell you is that there's so many people like me, but we need you to give us the space to fail. To fail. Because when we have the space, when we are in an environment where we feel liberated enough to try something different, right? To follow that nagging thing that's in our heart that's saying that we should move a certain direction or act a certain way. We need to have the freedom to believe that doing so would not jeopardize support from our funders, right? And so if you give us, could you imagine Pablo Picasso being dictated by his benefactor? I only want you to color by the numbers, right? You wouldn't be Pablo, right? We wouldn't get the masterpieces that we have today. And so, I think more than anything, finding the Desmonds that are out there and giving them the space to be as courageous as they can possibly be. Allow them to dream, to imagine, to be able to take a risk. And when we do so, we're going to get great rewards.
And Desmond, if I can stay with us for a minute, what would you say to the other Desmonds out there? What advice would you be giving them?
Ooh, what advice would I be giving to the other Desmond? I think some of the things that, I'm grateful for, I should say, is number one, really understanding that in spite of the chaos that's around, there were times when, I see everybody else was just getting support and getting the attention. And I was like, man, why am I not getting it? And there are times, I would admit that it felt like, man, maybe I should just stop or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, I didn't quit. And, and so the advice that I would give folks is don't abandon your dreams, right? Don't let what's going on around you dictate whether or not you're committed or your level of commitment, that you have to remain true to the vision that was given to you. And don't expect everyone else to have that vision that you have, because God didn't give them the vision. He gave you the vision, right? And you have to own that. And then the other thing is, you really got to do the analogy, the ham and cheese omelet analogy. You have to really search within yourself to find out if you're really the pig in this, right? Because if you're not, let's be real. If you find out, if you come to the conclusion that you are the chicken or you're the cow, then you need to find that pig and be supportive of that pig, right? But if you realize that you are the pig, if this is something that you're willing to die for, and it sounds so dramatic, but it is true. If it's the thing that you're willing to die for, then you hold on to that for your life and you keep pushing and you own that, because that is your journey and no one else could take it for you.
So Desmond, I have a final question for you. Um, one of the parts in the book that I really appreciated is when you talked about if you could just find one person that you could reach out to and have a positive impact on, if you could just help one person, that would be enough for you.
Wow. When I crossed the tracks and I asked myself, if the train would have killed me, how many people would come to my funeral? I had to change the scenario because, the initial answer was 0, like I said, but I changed it and said, my picture is on the front page. And I only came up with 4 people, and that bothered me. And I remember taking that feeling with me in the treatment, really questioning my existence, right? Desmond, after all these years, all these different relationships, only 4 people care if you died? Have your life been that insignificant? And I remember not too long after that, Rosa Parks passed away, and I remember sitting in a room watching how many people were paying their last respects as she laid in state in the rotunda of the Capitol. Seeing so many people come out with tears rolling down their cheeks. And I remember just jumping up and screaming at the television. I'm like, that's it. That's what I want. I started planning my funeral. and my mind racing, and I finally landed to have my funeral at Joe Robbie Stadium, right? I mean, I wanted the chairs on the field, standing room only, not a dry eye in the house, right? I wanted to feel as if my life was significant, right? It's a whole nother story there. You ought, and folks ought to get the book, just like you recommended. Let my people vote. But here's the piece, that when I helped that young man, when that young man told me that something I did that caused him to experience a paradigm shift, I realized in that moment that all of that pain and suffering that I went through in my life became worthwhile because I impacted one life. And that I didn't need the big funeral. I didn't need to have thousands of people say, man, Desmond changed my life in order for my life to be significant. That is not a quota that anybody needs to meet. Going back to even me being on that Time magazine, the thing, no, you don't have to help 1.4 million people to have an impact, to make your life justifiable, your time on this earth worthwhile. Man, if you change one life, that makes it worth it, and so I understood that, and it took a lot of load off of me, right? I wasn't trying to fill Joe Robbie Stadium or the Dolphin Stadium anymore, right? But that feeling felt so good that I became addicted to wanting to just help people, right? I already met my quota. Matter of fact, after passing Amendment 4, man, I'm 1.4 million times over my quota, right? And so I could die today, and I'm okay. And I don't have to have 1 million people at my funeral. I'm okay. I had an impact in somebody's life, and I know I did before I passed away. When I was at the railroad tracks, I didn't know of any impact I had on anybody's life in a positive way. I've more than met my quota now, and I'm good. But one is all it takes.
Well, Desmond, you've helped thousands of people, and I just want to say that your life is really an inspiration.
It's millions now. It's millions of
millions.
people. Because one of the things that and I have to say this, over the last, I would say, several years, the largest expansions to democracy, right? Those efforts were led by people directly impacted, right? Whether it was what I did in Florida with Amendment 4, what folks did in California with Prop 17, what folks did in Louisiana and North Carolina with even lawsuits. It's amazing that, the success that people that's directly impacted have had. But the other thing was, I never realized how winning in Florida created this steamroll, created this energy that now in so many states across the country that there are people and organizations that are believing that change can occur and are actually doing things. And so it's not just the 1.4 million people in Florida that's impacted. Man, there are so many lives in so many states across this country that are now being improved because they had something to look at, something to inspire them, something to give them hope. And so I understand that the impact that our work has had is now exponential, right? And so it's folks all over the country now, and it's amazing. It's humbling, because I did not foresee all of this.
Well, Desmond, thanks for the inspiration. Thanks for spending time with us today. And, once again, your story is really an example of finding meaning and purpose in service to others. And I want to thank you very, very much for all that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Desmond Meade's decision to push forward on the Amendment 4 ballot initiative with little support and defying conventional wisdom exemplifies what it means to exercise bold leadership. The movement Desmond built to pass Amendment 4 has been described as one of the most inspiring grassroots campaigns and surprising political victories of our time. As Desmond poignantly described during our discussion, he is motivated by forces greater than the work itself, overcoming drug addiction, homelessness, and incarceration, to embrace a calling to work in service of others. He leads with conviction and humility, willing to share his story that others might be inspired and learn, as Desmond likes to say, that anything is possible. As I listened to Desmond during the interview, the word perseverance kept coming to mind. The same perseverance that allowed Desmond to overcome personal difficulties and disappointment carried over to a leadership approach that centers steadfastness despite obstacles, setbacks, and opposition. Other things strike me about Desmond's story that together add up to an effective movement leadership approach. His willingness to admit what he doesn't know and ask for help, as he did at the start of the campaign, his understanding of the importance of constructing and constantly testing a narrative with broad appeal, resisting pressures, for example, to make the restoration of voting rights a partisan or racial issue, his collaboration with others, and most importantly, the importance he places on listening to the voices of lived experience. I also appreciated Desmond's willingness to speak directly to funders about how they can be helpful. He talked about other Desmonds out there in the world who philanthropy need to recognize and support, giving them the space to be courageous and, yes, fail. Making the point that is often ignored, Desmond correctly noted that when philanthropy is willing to take on risk and invest in bold leadership, the potential impact is great. How can philanthropy advance opportunity and justice? Support, trust, and get out of the way of bold leaders like Desmond Meade and their transformative ideas. And equally important, invest over the long haul, because winning the campaign is frequently just the first step in a longer process of lasting social change. It's been a great honor getting to know Desmond and hearing about his incredible leadership journey.